What would happen if you read 10,000 short stories? So I made a video not too long ago about the Ray Bradbury project, or the Ray Bradbury trio. Ray Bradbury is a famous science fiction author, one of the greatest science fiction authors of all time, one of the greatest short story writers of all time. And he suggested that if you wanted to become more creative, there was an easy way to do it. And that was to read one short story, one essay, and one poem every night for 1,000 nights in a row. And that would make you more creative. The idea is that by filling your mind with various ideas in various formats, your mind would start to make connections and couldn't help but come up with new and creative ideas. So don't get me misunderstood. The Ray Bradbury Challenge doesn't have anything to do with reading short stories by Ray Bradbury. I mean, you can, of course, but Bradbury certainly didn't write 1,000 short stories. I don't think he did anyway. I'm not sure what the number was. He wrote a lot. That is to read lots of short stories from lots of different people. And of course, as I do, I got to thinking, well, what if we jimmied that number up a little bit? Let's say we made this real big. What if we made this number 10,000? What would happen if you read 10,000 short stories? Let's think about timing for a minute. Let's use that one story a night rule as our benchmark, okay? That would mean that in a year, you would read 365 stories, okay? In 2 years, you'd read 730 stories. In 10 years, you read 3,650 stories. Okay, that's over the course of 10 years. In 20 years, you'll have read 7,300 stories. So even in 20 years, at a story a night, you're not going to get to 10,000 stories. To get to 10,000 stories, reading a story a night would take you 27 years. And let's just say, what if? What if someone did that? What would that do to a person? What changes would that make to a person? What would a person like that know that we don't? My name is Randy Ray. This is The Literate Texan. It's my channel on YouTube where we talk about books and literature, highbrow, lowbrow, everything in between. Try not to be too snobbish about it. Today, my topic is what would happen if you read 10,000 short stories. Part of my inspiration for this topic, incidentally, is there was a project called Read What You Own, the Read What You Own Challenge. And in the Read What You Own Challenge, the idea is that you read books that you already own but haven't read yet before you buy any more books. And the numbers that were suggested were like 25 books or 50 books. At the high end, 100 books. But my friend Michael K Vaughan said, no, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it big. I'm going to read 500 books before I buy another book. So he's been working on his Read What You Own challenge now for 2 or 3 years. He's got a yellow legal pad where he's listing the stories. And the last time I watched an episode where he mentioned it, he was up to like 250, 300. But that's why I wanted to come up with this crazy number, this crazy question of what would happen if you read 10,000 short stories. Because I wanted to take something and give it that big, big number. Just like Michael K Vaughan did with the Read What You Own challenge. Because you know what? It's interesting. It makes for a more interesting thought experiment to talk about a number that big. Now, 10,000 short stories sounds impossible. Sounds like a huge number. And usually when people are talking about reading and they're talking about counting, they're talking about counting the number of books. And you'll hear people talk about how they read 50 books last year, or their goal is to read 100 books this year. You'll occasionally find some real go-getters on BookTube, who might read 200, 250 books a year. You'll find controversy among people who say, oh, there's no way these people are really reading as many books as they claim to be reading. It's impossible. That's part of the fun of the big number, okay? I have had some criticism in some of my past videos where I've said what would happen if you read for an hour a day every day for so long, or what would happen if you read every day for 10 years, or what would happen if you read the 50 books in the Western canon, the 50 most important books, or whatever. I've come under some criticism for that because it sounds like I'm encouraging people to compete. And competition, as we know, is the thief of joy. and it sounds like that I'm trivializing reading or don't love reading as much because I'm budgeting time for it and looking at how much time it would take to accomplish this goal or that goal. I assure you that's not the case. I love reading just as much as anybody, and I would love it just as much even if I never counted how many books I read in a year. What I'm going to suggest to you is that my attitude is similar to the attitude of someone who enjoys reading about, thinking about, talking about, watching videos about extreme sports. I have friends who are runners, okay? And then some of them, they're happy to get in 10 miles a week. They'll run 3 or 4 times a week. They'll run 3 or 4 miles per run. They're perfectly happy and they're in incredibly good health as a result. I have one friend who's a marathoner, which seems pretty extreme to me. But that is not an extreme sport, okay? An extreme sport is an ultra marathoner. An ultra marathoner would be someone like David Goggins, who runs 100-mile races and breaks records for how many pull-ups he does inside of 24 hours. Okay, just because there are readers who are like that, extreme readers, and because I like talking about them and because I like thinking about where I'm at in comparison to them, does not mean that I'm encouraging you to compete with an ultra reader or an extreme reader at all. It's just interesting to talk about. And if some of it does apply to you and you're reading, great. If not, that's okay. It's still just a thought experiment. It's not a should. I'm not sitting here saying you should read 10,000 short stories. I'm just saying, what if you did? And let's talk about some numbers. We've talked about these numbers in the past, but according to most of the studies that I've seen and most of the surveys that I've seen, most readers read about 250 words per minute. Now that number varies, but with fiction, that's pretty standard average that you see fairly often is 250 words per minute. How many words do you normally see on a printed page? Now that varies a lot based on the format, okay? Some books you might see 250 or 300 words per page. With some magazines, you might see as many as 500 words on a page. So when it comes to thinking about how many pages an average short story is, it gets kind of dicey in terms of number of pages. It's probably easier to talk about how many words there are. An average short story, we're going to say for purposes of this video, is between 4,000 and 5,000 words. Now that's not any kind of authoritative number at all. It's just an average. There's such a thing called flash fiction, where you read and write 1,000 words or less and tell a story. There are plenty of great short stories out there that are 10,000 words long, that are 15,000 words long. Once you get up to about 40,000, 50,000 words, now you're starting to look into really short novel territory. A better definition of a short story has less to do with the number of words on the page than how long it takes to read. Edgar Allan Poe was one of the pioneers of the format, the short story. And when he talked about what a short story is and how it should be written, he talked about how it's a work that you should be able to complete in one sitting and that should inspire a singular emotional effect. It has one purpose. Okay, so with 4,000 to 5,000 words, if you're reading 250 words per minute, you're looking at between 16 and 20 minutes per story. That's not long. Reading a short story every night before you go to bed, it's not a big commitment. It's not even half an hour. Let's think about it. Your average sitcom is 22 minutes long. You think it's longer because there's commercials and it takes up a half-hour block on TV. But the truth is, without the commercials, it's 22 minutes long. 16 to 20 minutes is about the length of time in the first act of a drama on television, okay? So it's not a huge commitment to read a short story, not an average short story. And some short stories are longer. But yeah, reading a single short story, okay, that doesn't sound impossible at all. Reading a short story every night, when you keep that in mind, also doesn't sound impossible at all, unless you're just super, super busy. And there are some people who are going to say they're too busy to read, period. And they just don't want to read, okay? I don't know anybody who can't find an extra 15, 20 minutes a day to fit in a short story if they really want to. But 10,000 short stories, 10,000 is a big number, okay? Just to give you an idea, Anton Chekhov, one of the most famed and celebrated short story authors in the history of literature, wrote 522 short stories. That's the generally agreed upon number. Now, some people say it's closer to 500. Some people say it's closer to 600. We'll just call it 522 or 500. That's 5% of 10,000. You could read everything that Chekhov wrote, all of his short stories, and still only hit 5% of your 10,000 story target. Let's look at another benchmark. There is an annual anthology called The Best American Short Stories, and that's always followed by a year. So you have the Best American Short Stories of 2025, the Best American Short Stories of 2024, and so on. This anthology began in 1915, so it's been going on for 111 years. There's 111 editions of Best American Short Stories, okay? Now, I don't know if it's always been this way, but for as long as I can remember, and I've been reading the Best American Short Stories anthology every year for 20 or 30 years, there's always about 20 stories in it. So let's just assume that there's 20 stories in all 111 editions of this. We'll call it 100 editions just to make the math easier, okay? That's 2,000 stories, okay? 2,000 stories, that's still only 20% of your goal. If you read every single Best American Short Stories anthology, plus all the short stories of Anton Chekhov, you're still only 25% of the way to your goal. In other words, if you're going to read that many short stories, you're going to read a lot of short stories. One of the things I like about short stories too is there's lots of different places to find them, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But I'm just trying to get across to you the enormity of what 10,000 short stories means. Now, what does that mean in terms of being a reader? Okay, if you read 100 books, which is a lot more common of a goal, and it's something a lot more people think about. If you read 100 books, chances are you're going to read 100 different authors. You're going to get to know 100 different authors. Now, you might read a couple of books by the same author in there. So maybe fewer than 100 authors, but no more than 100 authors. Now, if you read 10,000 short stories, though, you're going to be exposed to thousands of authors. Even if you read all 522 of Anton Chekhov's short stories, you're still going to read thousands of authors. So what you're going to get here from reading 10,000 short stories is you're going to get an enormous amount of breadth as compared to depth. You're going to be exposed to a lot of different writers, but you're not necessarily going to get to know any of those writers really, really well. I like to compare it to speed dating, okay, or a coffee date. You go out on a lot of dates with a lot of different people. You're going to briefly get to know a number of people. But one of the things that I use short stories for is to find authors that I want to spend more time with. It's easy for me to find an hour to spend in an evening with just about any author there is, just to give them a chance. But for me to spend an entire weekend with an author, or heaven forbid they wrote a novel long enough that I spend an entire week reading it, or an entire month, they're going to have to be somebody that I like. I love going through anthologies and fiction magazines, reading authors and making note of the ones that really affect me so that I can go out and find novels by these guys and spend even more time with them. That just extends that whole dating metaphor even further, and it's a really neat thing. One of the ways I got started with this, my mom got me a subscription to the magazine of fantasy and science fiction when I was just 12 years old. This is the issue from March, I think, of 1982. And each of these has, 10 or 12 stories in it. But that's how I got to know the author Tom Disch. I read a short story of his in one of these magazines and absolutely loved it. So I decided, I'm going to go out and find a novel by him. And I read a novel by him called The MD. Still one of the best horror novels that I've ever read. Thomas Disch, very modest amount of fame. This is not someone I would have known about had I not been exploring short stories along with the other reading that I was doing. Now, one of the things that I've talked about repeatedly in my videos about reading and the reading life is that as you read more, you become better at pattern recognition. You see patterns in literature and stories because you've read a lot of them, and they do follow certain patterns. And I would contend that especially with literary fiction, you're going to see patterns of human behavior that you're going to be able to translate into real life experiences. Not every story is going to be realistic in terms of how humans behave, but a lot of them will, especially if you read literary fiction. That's going to translate into you being able to have better interpersonal relationships at work and in your family life and in your personal life. So there is a benefit to reading this many stories. And I would contend that if you're reading 10,000 short stories, no matter how quickly you're going about it or how slowly, you're going to become better at pattern recognition faster than you would if you were reading exclusively novels. Now, you might argue with me about that. I may be wrong. I don't know. But that's my guess. That's a wild guess, but I think it's a fairly educated guess too. Now, you might think this is just a thought experiment. Why waste time worrying about this? Why waste time thinking about this? No one's ever going to read this many short stories. It's not possible. Even if it were possible, nobody cares enough to do it. But I have a friend, Steve Donoghue. He's a Booktube guy. And this guy is an example of what you can accomplish if you're consistent and have a lot of time on your hands. This is a guy who makes 4 videos a day on average every day for YouTube, okay? So over time, he's probably recorded about 10,000 YouTube videos. I don't think there's anybody on YouTube, at least not in the book space, in Booktube, that's created as many videos as he has. And I know Steve. Steve reads very fast, okay? He's not a speed reader, but he does read very quickly because he has eliminated subvocalization. Now, that's a whole kettle of fish that I don't want to get into here. It's not something that I really understand or know about or that I'm particularly interested in learning how to do. But according to him, it's dramatically improved his rate of speed. Also, he has no life outside of reading and hasn't had a life outside of reading for years and years. And he's one of these genetic anomalies who doesn't need very much sleep at night. So he has more hours in the day to work with than we do. And if you're sitting around thinking that 10,000 short stories is impossible to have read, I want to point to Steve Donoghue as this is his claim to me. He's read 50,000 short stories, okay? He reads an average of, I think, 3 books a day, just books. And then in terms of short stories, he said that he's read 50,000. Now, these are extraordinary claims. And I've had people be skeptical of these claims in my comments below. I am not interested in having a debate over how much Steve reads compared to what he says he reads. I don't care. You know, I'm just saying the guy has read a lot of short stories. 10,000 is not as big a number as maybe we think it is. And I know we talked earlier about how that would take 27 years if you read 1 story a day. But you could very easily read more than a story a day. After all, we established already that you could finish a short story probably in about 20 minutes. You could very easily read 2 or 3 short stories a day. If you consistently read 3 short stories a day, it's not going to take you 27 years to finish 10,000 stories. You're going to finish 10,000 short stories in just 9 years. That's still a big commitment, okay? But it is not the lifelong reading project that we talked about before. It's a big project, but it's not a lifelong project. 9 years is just a really, really big, long project. It's fun and interesting to think about those numbers. And when I think about Steve Donoghue, I think about him as being like David Goggins, you know, the guy who runs these 100-mile races, and you think that's impossible, but then you look at him and you realize, hey, he's really done it. You can see that he's done it. And what's he like as a person as a result? And what is he like as a person that makes him do extreme things like this? That's food for thought. I'm going to let you think about that. Here's something else to think about. Different readers like different things. I know readers who read absolutely nothing but Harlequin romances. I know people who are only interested in mysteries. I know people that only read novels. I know people who only read nonfiction. I know people who only read biographies. Everybody has their preferences. You may determine that you're just somebody that likes short stories better than any other format of literature that there is. And if so, that's fine. You may be one of these people who eventually reaches that crazy number that we talked about at the beginning of the video, that crazy number of 10,000 short stories. And if so, good on you. I think that's great. And we defined a short story earlier in real general terms. Let's talk about it again, okay? Flash fiction is a form of short story that's, I think, relatively new, okay? I remember when I graduated from college, I was in my early 20s, there was a magazine called Story Magazine. It was a literary magazine, and it was all about short stories. And every year they had a contest for what they called a short short. This is a short story that was, I want to say, around 1,000 words. Now they call that flash fiction. That is definitely a kind of short story. And if you're reading flash fiction, you can definitely crank up the number of short stories that you get through really fast, because 1,000 words is a magnitude shorter of that average short story that we talked about, that average 4,000 and 5,000 words. Most flash fiction, that's a story that you can read in less than 5 minutes, okay? But there are numbers in between that 4,000 and 5,000 and that 40,000 to 50,000 number where you've got stuff called novellas or novelettes. And let's talk about the word counts and the number of pages for those. And just for fun, we'll say that a short story is anything between 1,000 and 7,000 words. Flash fiction is 1,000 words or less. A short story is 1,000 to 7,000 words. There's also something called a novelette, okay? This is a term that you don't hear very often. Novella you hear a lot more often than novelette. But if you get like the writer's guidelines to something like Fantasy and Science Fiction magazine, they will talk about novelettes. And a novelette generally runs from between 7,000 words to 17,500 words. Then you get into novella territory. That's between 17,500 words and 40,000 words. At 40,000 words, you're looking at a very short novel. An average novel these days is about 100,000 words. So a 40,000 word novel would be a very short novel. 50,000 word novel would be half of an average size novel. And that 50,000 number used to be important. 50,000 words used to be important because there used to be an event called NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month. And to qualify to finish NaNoWriMo, you had to write a novel, a new novel. You couldn't rework an old novel. And it had to be 50,000 words or more. That was the cutoff for the novel. And like I say, most publishers would consider that very small. If you're looking at something to sell to a publisher, you probably want to go more towards an average of between 90,000 and 120,000 words with your novel. As far as the length of your short stories goes, if you're a writer and you're writing short stories for publication, you should look at the writer guidelines, because they'll tell you how many words they're looking for, okay? Some magazines don't want flash fiction. Some do. Some don't want short stories any longer than 5,000 words, even though you and I have established that a short story can go up to 7,000 words and still be a short story. But remember, the most important definition for our purposes as readers is that a short story is something that you can finish in one sitting and that will have a singular emotional effect on the reader. Now, most of the readers I know, or a lot of the readers I know, read a lot of the same authors over and over again. That's to be expected, right? You realize that you really like Stephen King. Well, guess what? Stephen King's written 60 or 70 novels, a lot of which are really long. He's also written a handful of novella collections and a handful of short story collections. You could spend years reading nothing but Stephen King and have a pretty satisfying reading life, and that's okay. But if you start to specialize in short stories, it's going to become almost inevitable that you're going to read lots of different short story writers. And there are some authors who specialize in writing short stories. I've written some of their names down so that I don't forget them, but I want to give you a sampling of writers who specialized in the short story or who are really good at the short story that you might want to check out. Edgar Allan Poe, of course, is an American short story writer, one of the pioneers of the field. Anton Chekhov, the Russian that we talked about earlier, who wrote 522 short stories. You may have heard the expression Chekhov's gun. That's an expression that came from Chekhov when he talked about if you're staging a play or a story and there's a gun featured somewhere in the first act, that gun's going to have to get shot sometime in the third act. Guy de Maupassant, O. Henry. O. Henry is one of my favorite short story writers. O. Henry is famous for the twist ending. O. Henry wrote a story most people associate with Christmas, and I read it every Christmas. It's called The Gift of the Magi. But he wrote lots of short stories. I had the complete collected short stories of O. Henry at one time. I don't know what happened to it. It got lost in a move. I think the guy that I hired to move me left it behind. In fact, I'm sure of it. I'm still mad at him about it. But at any rate, it was a huge, thick volume full of short stories, many of which were short enough that you'd almost consider them flash fiction. But I love O. Henry. And if you're going to study the short story or specialize in the short story, it's going to be hard to avoid O. Henry, whether you like him or not. Some people don't like him. I've got a friend named Tom, and he's a really intelligent reader. But one of the things that he pointed out to me was that O. Henry wrote the same short story over and over again. He just changed the names and some slight details. He's exaggerating a little bit. O. Henry's formulaic in that he always has a twist ending that surprises you, but his stories are different. The characters are distinct. The situations are distinct. What's not distinct is, you know, it's going to have a surprise ending that's going to be kind of like a little gotcha moment, okay? Other names I want to mention are Ray Bradbury. We talked about him in the beginning of the video, about how, he's the guy who came up with the idea of the Ray Bradbury Challenge, where you're going to read 1,000 short stories, 1,000 essays, and 1,000 poems, one at a time, every night, okay? Alice Munro, Jorge Luis Borges. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. Forgive me. I'm just an old hillbilly Texan who likes to read. Stephen King, Ted Chiang. Those are just some names of some short story writers that I think you'll become familiar with once you dip your toe seriously into the water of short stories. And you may already be a short story fan. You may have already read short stories from all of these people and know which ones your favorites are and which ones aren't. Now, reading 10,000 short stories isn't just a way to get to know a lot of authors, okay? Another way to think about it is that it's an avenue or a way to explore the history of world literature, at least from a certain point towards now, okay? Because these short stories were written during very specific periods of history, okay? And the early age of the short story, we're going to say, starts around the early 1800s. You're talking about people like Nathaniel Hawthorne here. That's early short story stuff. Gothic fiction was the beginning of short story stuff. Edgar Allan Poe, before the Civil War kind of stuff. Eventually, you're going to get to a period where short stories become big. They become mass entertainment. But before that, short stories were still out there, but they may not have been as popular as novels. Charles Dickens, he wrote Sketches by Boz. Those are arguably short stories. But mostly he wrote novels, and a lot of writers did. But then you've got people like Mark Twain, who's, certainly famous for his novels. He's also famous for his essays, but he's definitely famous for his short stories. Who can forget the celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County? Bret Harte, is a famous early American short story writer. There are plenty of them. But eventually you get to a time period in the United States where short stories were like the primary form of entertainment. This is before TV. Radio was big, But every magazine, and there were lots of magazines, but every magazine was expected to carry at least one short story in it. But a lot of magazines carried multiple short stories in it, and a lot of magazines consisted of nothing but short stories. You know, here we're talking about the early 20th century, and we're talking about magazines, you know, in the pulp line, like Weird Fiction or Weird Tales, okay? Genre-specific stuff, but short stories nonetheless. That's where you're going to encounter people like H.P. Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith. And you're going to have pulp science fiction, where you've got stuff like Amazing Stories, which is a magazine of science fiction. The magazine of fantasy and science fiction started sometime in the 30s and 40s. It's a real old magazine too. My collection doesn't go back nearly that far. But in terms of mainstream literature and literary fiction, you know, you've got magazines like Harper's Magazine, you've got the Saturday Evening Post, you've got the Atlantic, you've got Esquire, you've got Collier's. You know, there's just countless magazines that all carried short stories. In the 1920s, F. Scott Fitzgerald, who's famous for writing The Great Gatsby, you know, that's not the only thing he ever wrote. He wrote 5 or 6 other novels besides that. But he was also a prolific author of short stories. He wrote well over 100 short stories. There are 4 main collections of his short stories, but there's a lot of his short stories that never got published outside of the magazines. But he was well paid for his short stories because he was really, really good at writing short stories. And the audiences knew it and they loved him. He was paid $3,000 a story. That was his going rate. And that was in 1925. Okay, $3,000 went places in 1925 that $3,000 doesn't go in 2026, that's for sure. Okay, and I'm not getting political about anything at all. I'm just saying, dollar ain't worth what a dollar was then. That should tell you something about the importance of the short story during the 1920s. Ernest Hemingway wrote several novels, but I would suggest that Ernest Hemingway is at his best as a creator, as a literary creator, with his short stories. And he pioneered something called the iceberg theory, which I'll talk about in a little bit, because there's lots of little things in short stories and fiction that happen during the history of the form. That brings me to the question of, if you are going to read 10,000 short stories, where are you going to find them? Okay. First of all, you're going to find them in anthologies. And there's 2 different kinds of anthologies when it comes to short stories. There's single author anthologies, like the complete short stories of Ernest Hemingway or the collected short stories of F. Scott Fitzgerald, and so on and so forth. That's a great place to start, especially if you like the particular author. I mentioned earlier that I used to have the complete short stories of O. Henry. But you'll also find anthologies that are themed. We talked about the Best American Short Stories. Those are themed according to quality, and they're focused mostly on literary fiction. But you'll also find all kinds of anthologies that are focused on specific genres. For example, there was a short story collection that I had as a boy called the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. And it was from the golden age of science fiction. And it was short stories that were in the science fiction niche that were written from the 1930s, the mid-1930s, until the mid-1960s. But you can find all kinds of anthologies around themes. You like vampires? You can find a short story collection around vampires. You like Sherlock Holmes? Well, there are 56 Sherlock Holmes stories written by Arthur Conan Doyle, and there's 5 books, 5 anthologies collecting short stories about Sherlock Holmes. But since he has slipped into the public domain, literally hundreds of writers have tried their hand at writing Sherlock Holmes stories, and you can find anthologies of nothing but Sherlock Holmes stories, which is to say nothing of crime stories and detective stories in general. My mom used to collect short story collections that featured Alfred Hitchcock on the cover. It was a branding move. I don't for a minute think that Alfred Hitchcock had a hand in picking those short stories or editing those short stories at all. He just lent his name to the cover. And he did come up with, or his branding people did come up with clever names. Alfred Hitchcock's Stories to Keep You Up at Late Night. Alfred Hitchcock's Stories That Scared Even Me. That was one of my favorites growing up. My mom had a collection of short stories called The Ghouls by Peter Haining. That was the editor. And this was a collection of short stories, all of which had been turned into horror movies at one time or another. And then, of course, we already talked about magazines. If you like genre fiction, there are plenty of magazines to choose from out there. In the detective niche, for example, you've got Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine and Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine. You can still find them in the newsstands, okay? Monthly, or I don't know, they may be bi-monthly now, but they were monthly for a long, long time. But every month, you can get 10, 15, 20 short stories in there. In the world of science fiction, there's plenty of science fiction magazines still out there. Fantasy and Science Fiction Magazine, I know, only comes out every other month now. But there's also Analog Science Fiction Magazine and Asimov's Science Fiction Magazine, which has little to do with Isaac Asimov, as he's been dead for years. But he did lend his name to the magazine. But even when he was alive, he didn't have that much to do with the magazine. Yeah, but, you know, if you're into science fiction, you've got that. There are magazines out there that specialize in telling stories of the Old West. There are magazines out there that tell adventure stories. There are a lot of really low circulation, low print number literary fiction magazines that are out there. Plowshares, for one example. The New Yorker publishes fiction, but usually you only get one story per issue in the New Yorker. But yeah, there's plenty of magazines out there, plenty of anthologies out there. Finding 10,000 short stories to read is not that challenging. They're out there. But if you want to experience 200 years of literary fiction and experimentation and genres, you can certainly do that. And then just skip it around. You want naturalism? There's short stories from the naturalism period. You want realism? There's short stories from that period. And there are authors that wrote short stories specifically in those genres. I'm just looking at my notes here. Naturalism, for example, was popular from 1890 to 1915. Some of the authors that you're going to encounter if you study naturalism through short stories would include Frank North. These books are about poverty and survival and nature, okay? Jack London, Stephen Crane, these are authors from the naturalist period. I don't have these things memorized. You know, I'm not an English professor. I have to take notes when I research these videos. So sometimes I have to look at them. You know, when I think of postmodernism, I usually think of novels rather than short stories. But Donald Barthelme has written plenty of postmodern short stories. Italo Calvino also. You're talking about a period from 1970 to about 2000. That's when postmodernism was starting to become popular. It might seem like that I'm rambling here, but I'm not rambling. It seems that way because of the enormity of the subject, okay? But let's talk about genres of short stories and what questions those kinds of short stories answer. For example, the horror short story is a very popular one. H.P. Lovecraft, Stephen King. But it answers a question. What scares us? That's a simple one. What about science fiction? You're looking at people like Ray Bradbury, Isaac Asimov, Ursula K. Le Guin. You know, what questions is science fiction asking? Well, they're asking, what if this technology exists? Or what if the future holds this? What's that going to mean for the human race? These are important questions to think about. Fantasy, that asks the question, what if magic were real? What would life be like then? What if myth were real? Lord Dunsany wrote short stories in the fantasy genre. Robert E. Howard. One of my favorite authors of short stories in the fantasy genre was Michael Moorcock. There's an author who didn't write much outside of fantasy or outside of fantasy and science fiction magazine named John Moresi. And he wrote a bunch of short stories about a wizard named Kedrigurn who was in love with a young woman named Princess. And it was mostly their love story, but he specialized in counter magic and counter spells. And he was great. These stories had a terrific sense of humor, and they were collected into collections, but mostly you found them and read them right here in Fantasy and Science Fiction magazine, and people like me really looked forward to them. Okay, so that's an example of some of the genres in the questions that they ask. Mystery is another genre. It asks, how do we know who did it? Okay, Arthur Conan Doyle was a seminal figure in terms of literary mystery stories. So was Arthur Conan Doyle, but certainly not just then. Agatha Christie wrote short stories in the niche too. One of my favorites, he writes detective fiction and crime fiction, is Jeffrey Deaver. And Jeffrey Deaver is an author I did not discover through his novels. I discovered through a collection of his short stories. And man, let me tell you, the collected short stories of Jeffrey Deaver, it's a book you got to get a hold of. It's really great, man. And I found his collection of short stories because the same people who publish the best American short stories also publish the best American crime stories or the best American mystery stories. I'm not sure which. And one of his stories showed up in there, and I went out to find more stuff by him. And I wasn't ready to try a novel yet, but I was willing to try more of his short stories. And they had, I read off of an e-reader, but they had his e-book with his collected short stories on sale, so I just grabbed it. Literary fiction answers questions like, what does it mean to be alive? What is that experience like? Who writes short stories in that area? Well, plenty of people. We've already talked about a bunch of them. Hemingway, Steinbeck, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Faulkner. These guys all wrote short stories in the literary fiction genre. Even if you're into Western fiction, there's short stories. There's magazines that specialize in articles about the Old West and stories set in the Old West. Elmore Leonard wrote a whole bunch of everything. He was known for his crime writing, but he also wrote Western short stories. Louis L'Amour didn't just write Western novels. He wrote Western short stories too. There's plenty of those to be found out there still. Not as many as there used to be, mind you, but they're still out there if you're into Westerns. So what can you get exposed to if you read 10,000 short stories? Okay, you can get exposed to thousands of different lives. Get exposed to thousands of different cultures, classes, religions, occupations. If not thousands, at least hundreds. Okay, but a broad range of things just to think about. And again, it's that breadth versus depth thing. If you're reading short stories, you're learning a little bit about a lot of things. That's not necessarily a bad thing, although I do think it's a good idea to learn a lot about single things too. A balanced reading diet would include short stories, but I don't know that it would necessarily be dominated by short stories. Even if you went on a crazy project to read 10,000 short stories, I think you'd still want to fit some novels in there. After all, this is the one life that you've got to live. And this is the only reading that you're ever going to get to do. Okay. Harold Bloom said we're all reading against the clock, and it's true. It's going tick-tock, tick-tock. You only get to read so many books, and then it's over. The library's closed for good. So choose carefully. And I'm going to suggest that reading short stories is going to make you a better reader in the same way that reading any kind of prose does. It's going to improve your vocabulary. It's going to make you more empathic. You're reading fiction. Empathy is a good thing. It's going to make you a better person. It's going to make you a kinder person. This is a good thing. You're going to get better at recognizing patterns. Your ability to comprehend what you read, that's going to improve naturally as you read more. Reading comprehension is a skill that you learn through practice, just like any other. You're going to be able to identify themes in literature that you wouldn't necessarily otherwise be able to identify. You're going to recognize symbols as they come up, symbolism. I know some people, they're not necessarily literary critics. They tend to think that literary critics make too much of symbolism. And they also like to point out that a lot of authors say, hey, I didn't have any symbols or symbolism in mind when I wrote that. But you know what? Once the author creates the work of art, They don't get to decide whether the symbols are there or not. It's you, the reader, that gets to decide whether the symbols are there or not. They're there. It's part of the subconscious. It's part of the human experience. It's there, and you'll recognize them if you get enough reading and enough words under your belt, whether they're short stories or novels. You read enough short stories, you're going to begin to recognize what are cliches. You're going to begin to recognize what's original. You're going to start to develop taste, okay? There is good and there is bad, okay? Yes, literary and artwork stuff is subjective, but it's not entirely subjective. There is such a thing as good literature and bad literature, okay? That's not me being snobby, that's just me being realistic. There are qualitative differences in literature, and that's okay. You know, just because you like something doesn't mean it's good. And just because something's bad doesn't mean you can't like it. And vice versa. There are some things that I can recognize as being exceptionally well written that just don't speak to me. They just don't work for me. And that's all right, okay? But I've got enough taste to recognize greatness when I see it. Doesn't mean I respond to it or like it. So what happens if you read 10,000 short stories? Well, you know what? You're going to become well read. That's what we talk about on this channel all the time. You read a lot, you're going to become well read. It almost doesn't matter what you read a lot of. As long as you're not reading pure trash and pure garbage all the time, and some people do. If you're reading quality stuff, the format doesn't matter, okay? If you read 1,000 science fiction novels, if it's good science fiction, you're going to become well read. You're going to become smarter. You're going to become a better person. Same holds true with 10,000 short stories. It's going to look different. The shape of it's going to be different. You're going to recognize patterns faster. You might become quicker at picking up themes and literary structure by reading short stories, just because a story is a story is a story, no matter the length, okay? It's got a beginning, a middle, and an end. There's a conflict, there's a setting, there's characters. You're going to recognize these things faster if you're exposed to more of them, even if it's in a shorter format. There's a reason I made this video about short stories. I'm not ready to reveal what it is yet, but if you subscribe to the channel, you'll see, because there's going to be a video coming up soon also about short stories that you're not going to want to miss. Until then, subscribe to the channel, stay hydrated. It's so much more important than you probably think. And stay sexy, folks. I love you. I'll see you in the next video.